Hello, everyone. Starting a little early just to make sure that everything works out. Welcome to my bedroom. Gotta remember where to look. Haven't done this before. Hopefully, I won't stumble over words too much. Sometimes I don't read aloud very often, so I might hit a few words, stumble blocks. Bear with me. It'll probably get better as I practice, as it were. I'm going to probably start at 7 proper, which is in about 4 minutes. But like I said, I just wanted to make sure I could see it with the light coming in, that video was working. Give people a couple minutes to give Sashi a few minutes to come say hello. Come on. Come on. Hi, sweet boy. He wants to say hello. This is Sasha. He's our little sweet boy. Alexander Filipovich is his official name, but we call him Sasha. So I got this idea from a YouTuber named Footless Joe. She's a non-congenital amputee who is a very energetic and a positive person who is sharing her experience so that she to help other people. And she had the idea of reading aloud and to help people who are socially distant and feeling a little isolated. And so I'm going to pick up on that idea. I'd advise you to, if you want, to look her up here on YouTube. It's Footless J.O. She is reading Ready Player One, which interestingly is maybe spoilers, but also sort of breaking through some of the social distancing that we go through in this technological world. Not sure if that was meant to be, but I noticed it today, just thinking about it. So I see we have 2 people. You found the stream. Sashi found the stream too. You should have found the stream. I posted it in Nuke Chili Heads. Come on, Sash. Oh, yeah, that's what they want to see. A little trouble puffs. Deflated trouble puffs. About a minute to go. Here's the cover of the book. It's The Diamond in the Window by James Langton. It's a probably geared towards let's see, what do you guys call it? We call it middle school, which is approximately 5 through 8 or 9, but I have read this as an adult. In fact, the only time I've read it, it was as an adult, and I enjoyed it. And one of them, I think about 5th in the series, is called The Fragile Flag. And it's something that I think should be a must read. So there you go. Well, it's time to start. So again, the book is The Diamond in the Window. by Jane Langton. I'll read the back. The clues to the mystery were in the window. Eleanor and Eddie are searching for the lost children, Ned and Nora, who vanished from the old room at the top of the house without a trace. In the room, they find verses scratched on the window by Prince Krishna before he too disappeared. Now the verses become clues to guide them, but the search is long and mysterious, leading the children deep into dreams that turn into real-life nightmares. Let's see, anything else in that? No, okay. This is a picture of the front hallway, and you see Lady Liberty there. She'll be mentioned. The Diamond in the Window by Jane Langton, with illustrations by Eric Blevgod. For Christopher and David. I'm looking forward to reading it with you, Nuke. Has a quote from Ralph Waldo Emerson. On him the light of star and moon shall fall, with pure radiance down. Him nature giveth for defense his formidable innocence. The mounting sap, the shells, the sea, all spheres, all stones his helpers be. Ralph Waldo Emerson. The first chapter is called Edward Misbehaves. Here's the title picture. Edward Misbehaves. Edward Hall sat under the front porch of the big house on Walden Street in Concord, Massachusetts, and thought about his two ambitions in life. The first was to be the President of the United States. That was not very likely, but it was at least possible. The second was unlikely and impossible altogether, because he had been born into the wrong family. Why, oh why, wasn't his name Robert Robinson instead of Edward Hall? Eddie took out of his pocket a collection of bottle caps, matchboxes, and pennies, and arranged them on the ground in a decorative pattern. If only fathers and mothers would be more careful when they choose names for their children. If only they would pick names that sounded well in backwards English. Edward Hall, for example, was all right in ordinary English, but it was terrible the other way around. Drawdee-lah. It didn't sound like anything. But Robert Robertson, there was a name. If you turned it backward and softened the S, it was transformed into a name as strange and as fantastic as that of an ambassador from some foreign land. Trebor Nosnibor. Edward put his two ambitions in life together and whispered under his breath, "Introducing the President of the United States, Mr. Trevor Nosnibor." How glorious, Edward sighed. His older sister squeezed through the broken place in the lattice and squatted down beside him. Eleanor was taller and thinner than Edward, and she wore glasses because her eyes were weak. Her hair was red, like his, and it hung in a long pigtail down the middle of her back. Eleanor was very fond of a boy in her class named Benjamin Parks. She switched her long pigtail over her shoulder and stared earnestly, through the broken slats. "Someone's coming," she said. "And you know who it is? It's Mr. Preek. What do you suppose he wants with Aunt Lily?" Mr. Preek was the president of the bank and a selectman. With him was his secretary, Miss Prawn. These two sterling citizens of Concord had decided to take matters into their own hands. In their opinion, this affair of the Halls had been allowed to slide along, in the most slipshod way, for far too many years. It was high time some responsible person did something about it. They meant to, and here they were. Their faces were grim. Mr. Preak wore a long, grim vest. Miss Prawn was swathed about in a grim black cape, although it was a nice warm day in June. She poked her foot at a stove in place. She poked her foot at a stove in place in the porch floor and pursed up her lips. Aunt Lily came to the door. Her face went white when she saw who her visitors were. "Come in," she said. The visitors stayed exactly 10 minutes. When they came out, Eleanor and Edward were still under the porch, listening through the hole in the floor. "As soon as I possibly can," said Aunt Lily. $712 is a great deal of money in back taxes, Miss Hall," said Miss Prawn. "The property would be bring a great deal more if you sold it for the price of the land," said Mr. Preak. "But our house is on it," said Aunt Lily. "Tear it down and live somewhere else," said Mr. Preak. "Good day, Miss Hall." Edward and Eleanor listened. They could hear the thump-thump of Mr. Preak's feet going down the steps and the crack-crack of Miss Prawn's. Aunt Lily shut the door so quietly it made no noise at all. Mr. Preak stopped at the gate and looked back. Miss Prawn looked back too and shook her head. They were talking about the house. Eleanor and Edward, hidden under the porch, listened with all their ears. "A monstrosity, of course," Mr. Preak was saying. "Those dreadful towers, those turrets." "And on such holy ground," said Mrs. Prawn. "The sacred soil of Concord, cradle of American liberty." Out of my tea, mister. Excuse me. I've got my tea with whiskey here, keeping away the dew. Ah, very nice. Where was I? Let's see. "And on such holy ground," said Miss Prawn, "the sacred soil of Concord, cradle of American liberty, where the Minutemen fought their first battle of the American Revolution," said Mrs. Preak, "on the 9/10 of April in 1775 at the Old North Bridge." "As the crow flies," said Miss Prawn, flapping her black cloak and looking like a crow herself. "Hardly a mile from this spot." "And do you realize, Miss Prawn," said Mr. Preak, "that this ghastly object is within full view of the home of Ralph Waldo Emerson?" He gazed sadly across the field at the stream of tourists going and coming from the Emerson Square White House. "What must they think?" he said. "And of course," said Miss Prawn, "it's scarcely a quarter of a mile from Orchard House, house of Louisa May Alcott. Don't forget that." "How could I?" said Mr. Preak. "How could I fit the author of Little Women?" "And let me remind you, too, Mr. Preak, that this house stands on the very street that leads to Walden Pond, Henry Thoreau's Walden Pond. Did I ever tell you?" said Miss Prawn. "My own dear grandfather put Henry Thoreau in jail." "No," said Mr. Preak. "You never told me. What a glorious heritage." His brow darkened, and he shook his fist at the Hall's big house. "This blot, this stain must come down." "Those Halls haven't a leg to stand on legally," said Miss Prawn. Mr. Preak looked smug. "No, indeed," he said. "Within the year we'll have it for unpaid taxes, and then—" Eleanor and Edward, listening under the porch, stiffened. "Then what?" whispered Eddie fiercely. Mr. Preak was smiling nastily. He made a gesture like someone striking a match. He held out his hand with the invisible match in the direction of the house. Miss Prawn clapped her hands. "Out in the street they'll be, the four of them," said Mr. Preak. This was too much for Edward. He shot through the broken lattice and planted himself in front of Mr. Preak and Miss Prawn. "Summatoph I'm not sure what that meant," cried Edward. Mr. Preak was quite stout. No, no, shouted Eleanor, still under the porch and on hands and knees. Oh, I get it. Miss Prawn and Mr. Preek recoiled from the small, dirty eddy and then brushed past him. Stark raving mad, the lot of them, said Miss Prawn loudly. Everybody knows it. Kicks more boroom, shouted Edward. Miss Prawn was rather thin, and Miss Prawn and Mr. Preek looked a little frightened. They scuttled on down the street without looking back. Eleanor was giggling hysterically. Oh, Eddie, you shouldn't have. What I didn't realize was the first word, samatopapi, was hippopotamus backwards, and kicksmorb was broomstick backwards, so he was calling him hippopotamus and broomstick. That's the end of chapter 1. I can go on, or I could save it for another video. Any opinions? I think I'll read one more chapter. The Hidden Chamber. Here's the picture. What's the matter with our house? Said Edward. He stood with Eleanor on the bank of the little mill brook that ran through the field behind the Emerson place. They were looking back at the house they had grown up in, as if seeing it for the first time. I think it's pretty, said Eleanor. Of course, it does need painting. Yes, it certainly does, said Edward. Don't you think it looks a little like the Taj Mahal? Said Eleanor. All of the other houses on the street were neat, square, white buildings with dark shutters and simple pitched roofs. Out from among them mushroomed the Hall's house, like an exotic tropical plant in a field of New England daisies. It was a great wooden Gothico-Byzantine structure, truly in need of painting. Big as it was, it looked airy and light, as though the wind might pick it up and carry it away. Screened porches ballooned and billowed out of it all around, and domes and towers puffed up at the top as though they were filled with air. That's funny, said Edward. You see that window in the tower, shaped like a keyhole? I don't remember ever looking out that window. Do you? Eleanor looked at it. No, she said. And it's made out of colored glass, too. I'm sure I'd remember looking out of it if I ever had. Come on, said Edward. Let's find it. At their front gate, Eleanor paused. If Louisa May Alcott or someone famous like that had lived here once, they wouldn't talk about burning it down. No, said Edward. They'd charge admission and show you around. Eleanor looked down hopefully at her little brother. If only you were already the President of the United States, then everyone would want to come and see the house where you were born, and they would pay for it too. By the time I get to be president, said Edward, there'll be nothing left of it but ashes. Eleanor looked up sadly at the house. Then she started talking rapidly in a queer high voice. Ladies and gentlemen, she said, if you will kindly line up, I will conduct you on a most interesting tour of the birthplace of our great president, Edward P. Hall. Sign the guest book, please. Edward solemnly pretended to sign. That will be 50 cents in advance, quavered Eleanor. Thank you. Now then, no shoving, right this way. Here before you, on the lawn, you see the beautiful gazing globe in which our great president used to look as a boy to predict his own glorious future. Edward peered deep into the shining silver surface of the gazing globe. He pretended to see his future in it and staggered back as if he couldn't believe his eyes. No, he said. Eleanor grabbed his arm and hurried him along. Now, ladies and gentlemen, she said, if you'll climb the steps and enter the front door, hurry up, Eddie, you will see before you the magnificent insides of our great president's front hall. Aunt Lily was in the front hall, sitting at her desk. Her little gooseneck lamp made a tiny spot of light in the gloomy shadows under the vast overarching balcony. Eleanor introduced Aunt Lily to her crowd of invisible tourists. "Here," she said, waving grandly, "you see before you the aged aunt of our great president, Miss Lily Hall." "Go ahead, Aunt Lily," said Edward. "Stoop over and look aged." "It isn't as hard as you might think," said Aunt Lily. "Oh, drat, there's a blot." She sopped up the ink with the corner of the blotter and started adding her column figures again. Eleanor looked fondly at Aunt Lily. If you called her a spinster, it didn't seem the right word at all. She was tall and strong and handsome, like a pilgrim woman, or so Eleanor always thought, and she would ever have been pretty if her red hair were not pulled back so harshly into a tight bun. Eleanor couldn't remember a time when Aunt Lily had not been the choir mistress in the big white church around the corner, and when she hadn't taken in piano pupils like washing. I'm sorry, I read that sort of wrong. Couldn't remember when she had not been the choir mistress of the big white church around the corner, and when she hadn't taken in piano pupils like washing. Among Eleanor's earliest memories was the familiar sight of Aunt Lily playing the organ in the choir loft of the church, her head pumping vigorously up and down to mark the rhythm for the choir, her hands running nimbly up and down the keyboards, and her feet shifting sideways, heel and toe, to make the deep droning notes of the bass. Aunt Lily stood up, looking worried, with her account book in hand. "Have you seen Uncle Freddie?" she said. Eleanor knew where Uncle Freddie was, and she decided to include him in the tour. She swept to the parlor arch and pulled back the threadbare curtain. "Behold," she said, "Mr. Frederick Hall, uncle of our great president, friend of Emerson, friend of Thoreau." He wasn't really, of course. Emerson and Thoreau had both died long before Uncle Freddie was born. But dear Uncle Freddie was not altogether sound in his mind, and he was confused about this. His heroes and companions were the marble busts of Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry Thoreau that stood beside the hearth in the parlor. Waldo and Henry seemed to talk to him, just as he did to them. They had long conversations, and afterwards he would tell everyone what they had said, forgetting that he had read it himself in their books long ago. He was Aunt Lily's older brother, and he had a kind of absurd dignity that was all his own. His sister and his nephew and his niece were devoted to him. "Fred, dear," began Aunt Lily. Uncle Freddie paid no attention. He was banging Thoreau's marble tie. "But, Henry, old fellow," he said, "you declare that man is but a grain of sand in the great broad scheme of nature. I agree with Waldo that nature is but the mirror of the soul, a metaphor of the human mind, an allegory, a colossal, thumping, gigantic allegory." "Fred, dear," said Aunt Lily again. Uncle Freddie looked around vaguely, his arm around Henry. "What's that?" he said. Aunt Lily bit her lip. "All right, dear, never mind," she said. She turned and went out again. Eleanor could see that she had gone to Uncle Freddie for help, and then had decided to bear the burden, as always, alone. Eleanor remembered what Miss Prawn had said. "Stark raving mad, the lot of them. Everyone knows it." She felt an ache for a minute on behalf of Uncle Freddie, and a strong desire to kick Miss Prawn in the shin. But she shook herself, scowled at Eddie, and then went on with the exhibition. The invisible tourists were very impressed with the statuary in the hall. There was a plaster bust of Louisa May Alcott there, and a hat rack named Miss Truth. Both of them, of course, had inspired our great president to higher things. Mrs. Truth was a beautiful life-size bronze lady standing on the newel post at the foot of the stairs. She wasn't a hat rack really, but it was very convenient to throw scarves and umbrella handles over her outflung arm and to hang hats on the book she carried in her hand. And she was inspiring to look at. Her face had classic features and a noble expression. Secretly, Eleanor thought she resembled Aunt Lily. Her name came from the word engraved on a sort of bandage across her front. It said, "Truth." Nubby approves. One arm held up a light fixture shaped like a star. The star had a light bulb in it, but there was something the matter with the wiring and it didn't work. The next wonder to be looked at was the stuffed peacock, Percival, on the landing. He, too, had been a source of deep inspiration to President Edward P. Hall. His feathers were a little ruffled with age. His neck, had a dislocated jog in it, and most of his feathery crest was gone. But he clung proudly with his claws to a tall stand and gave the worn stair carpet an air of grandeur. Then Eleanor walked upstairs and displayed the bedroom that had been occupied by the president as a boy. The president hadn't made his bed. The president's sister scolded the president. "What about the window we were looking for?" said the president, changing the subject. "Where do you suppose it is?" "It must be in the attic," said Eleanor. She led the way along the balcony and up the attic stairs. At the top of the stairs, they came out into a complicated hugeness of the attic, where, with its octagonal and circular spaces, were towers projected on the outside. The floor was cluttered with boxes and trunks. There was a dressmaker dummy at one side, looking ghostly in a black cloth shroud. Edward and Eleanor made a circuit of the attic, looking for the keyhole window. They couldn't find it. Downstairs, someone began playing the piano noisily. It was Mary Jane Broom, one of Aunt Lily's piano pupils, taking her weekly lesson. Edward closed his eyes and thought. There were the second-floor windows and the attic windows, but I think this one was all by itself on the top. There must be another set of stairs or a ladder, but they could find neither ladder nor stairs. Then they examined the ceiling, and in one of the round tower openings, the ceiling showed a crack. It was a rectangular crack, and at one end of it there was a little ring. Edward poked at the crack with an old snowshoe. The ceiling jiggled all along the crack. "Hooray!" he said. "It's a trap door." He ran downstairs for a rope and came back all the way from the cellar, 2 steps at a time. "Do you want to get on my shoulders?" he said. "Or shall I get on yours? Look, I'll bend over and you can stand on my back." "What for?" said Eleanor. "To put the rope through the rings, silly. Come on." "Ow, ow, hurry up." "There," said Eleanor, getting down with the final grinding dig of her heavy shoe in Edward's back. The rope was safely through the ring. "Don't lose the end," said Edward. "There now, let's pull." They pulled. The crack wobbled, then slammed shut again. They pulled harder. "Watch out," said Eleanor, dodging back. The crack had been the outline of a set of ladder steps folded up in the ceiling. The ladder came down now slowly and smoothly and dropped its bottom step softly at their feet. It was a stairway where there had been no stairway. Eleanor looked doubtfully up into the darkness at the top. "It's probably just more old trunks up there," she said. "Probably," said Edward. He looked up too. "You go first," said Eleanor, looking at him. Edward paused, then put his foot on the bottom step. "All right," he said. He climbed sturdily upward. Eleanor watched his plump, short legs go up. Hesitantly, she began to follow. He paused when his head went over the edge of the crack and stopped. Eleanor stopped too. "Well?" she said. "I can't see," said Edward. "There, now I'm getting used to it. There's the window, there's—" His voice stopped, and he stood stock still. "Tell me!" demanded Eleanor. "Oh," said Edward, his voice caught. It wasn't like Edward to be surprised by anything. He was matter-of-fact and took things as they were. Eleanor felt herself breathing hard. She twitched her She twitched his trouser leg. What? She said. Silently, Edward moved over and made room for Eleanor to stand beside him. Her tall head rose slowly higher than his into the hidden chamber. She, too, was blinded at first by the dimness. Then the many colors of the great keyhole window blossomed in the dark and gradually illuminated the objects in the room. Were there two windows facing one another? No, one was the reflection of the other, in a huge mirror that was sunk into the well of an enormous dresser across the room from the window. There was a table, and what was that on the table? Like a castle? It was a castle made of blocks, and there were chairs and toys and a little wagon. And what was that on either side of the window? Eleanor's heart bounded into her throat. It was two narrow beds, and the covers were turned neatly down. That's the end of chapter 2. I showed you the picture at the beginning. This is the front hall. You can see Lady Truth there, holding her hats and her light with the shape of the star. That doesn't work. Can you see the peacock? You can see a bust. You see a bust over here. And the light's a little wonky here. I guess no peacock. Well, anyway. So that is the first and second chapters. Hopefully it doesn't bleed. That is the first and second chapters. I hope you enjoyed them. Again, this is meant to be practice. So here I am, and hopefully I'll be reading more as the days go on. I don't know if I'll do it every night or every other night or once a week or what. I'm glad you found it relaxing. Well, good night, everyone. I know it's late for you guys. It's not quite as so late here. It's only 6:30-ish. And I hope you have a good, silly Saturday before I wake up. And I guess that's about it. Good night, guys.